Here's a not so fun fact about me. Every so often, usually very late at night, I will lie down on this couch and stare at the ceiling, wondering out loud to myself, why do my videos suck so much? Unfortunately, it's a pretty common occurrence for me these days, and I know countless other creators, artists, and just people in general who have very similar thoughts racing through their minds. Maybe this happens to you as well, and if it does, I wouldn't be surprised. It's well documented that these types of thoughts happen to pretty much everyone. In fact, it's so well known that it actually has a name. Having these self-doubting thoughts is called imposter syndrome, and it's a pretty universal condition that happens to pretty much everyone in any profession. However, in my experience, imposter syndrome can get really bad in the context of the furry fandom, so much so that it starts to take away from the joy that this fandom provides to its members. And I know that because imposter syndrome gets to me all of the time. But it's not all bad news. In fact, I tend to snap out of it pretty quickly nowadays, since there are many proven methods to get you out of that headspace and back to your normal self. Let me explain. And let's start with just a formal definition of what imposter syndrome is. Imposter syndrome can be defined as the condition of feeling anxious and not experiencing success internally, despite being high-performing in external, objective ways. Now, that's a lot of words, so let's break this down a bit. In fact, I think it actually makes more sense to look at the definition backward. Basically, imposter syndrome is when you are succeeding in something in very measurable ways, yet you don't feel any satisfaction even after achieving it, especially when comparing what you do to what other people are achieving. Most of the time, this feeling is discussed in professional settings, where people who are doing well at their jobs may not feel like they are doing enough, and they feel bad about themselves because of it. But now that I've been in the fandom for a little bit, there's actually a lot of ways that those same feelings of imposter syndrome relate to being a furry as well. At the core of this negative line of thinking is a contradiction of what you are actually doing or what you actually have against your feeling of not doing or not having enough. For example, you may feel like you don't have any friends in this fandom and everyone you know seems to know everyone else. You might think your fursona or your fursuit looks dumb and all the other ones you see just look so much better. And these thoughts become doubly true if you create something in this fandom, like if you're an artist or a writer or a content creator. You might think your art sucks and that you'll never be as good as someone who seems to be so much more successful than you. And when something does go well, you play it off as luck or just thinking the algorithm was being nice to you that day. It's crazy. There are so many more examples that I could give that follow this negative line of thinking. And again, it's easy for me to do because I'm speaking from experience here. And if you're also like me, then you're also familiar with some of the initial ways to compensate for these negative thoughts that may not be the healthiest way to deal with them. This too is pretty well documented and is commonly summarized as the 5 phases of dealing with imposter syndrome. This includes the perfectionist phase, where you internalize the feeling that you have to do everything perfectly for it to be properly recognized. There's the expert phase, where you feel like you need to know everything to be worth having a conversation with. There's the soloist phase, where you feel like you have to do everything alone to prove that you don't need anyone's help. There's the natural genius phase, where you get frustrated when things get difficult because you think everything should just come naturally to you. And there's the super person phase, where you try to avoid having people finding out your flaws by trying to be good at literally everything. You may have tried putting on 1, 2, or maybe even all of these faces at once to help you feel better about your imposter syndrome and give yourself that feeling that you are worth it. But I'm sure you know that none of these are sustainable ways of living. They all lead to burnout in some way, and more importantly, they hide different aspects of you as a person, which after a while, people start to pick up on and wonder if they're talking to the real you or the mask you're putting on for them. Now, thankfully, you don't have to resort to putting on one of those faces to help process and manage your imposter syndrome. There are many other healthier methods to help avoid that line of thinking clouding your view of your own value. Now, before we go on, I do want to remind everyone that I am not a therapist, licensed or otherwise. I mean, I have an engineering degree. I'm bad with dealing at people. Why do you think I dress up as an animal to scare them off? But thankfully, most of the ways that I deal with imposter syndrome are actually very logical and straightforward to understand. And I have a high level of confidence that if they worked for me, then they could certainly work for you. And the first step is actually one that you've probably been doing if you've made it this far into the video. Recognize what you're feeling. Yes, it sounds obvious, but giving a name and a definition to what you're feeling helps with knowing how to deal with it. And on top of that, there's no need to feel bad about having these feelings themselves because you're not alone. Like I said, pretty much everyone has had some level of imposter syndrome in anything that they do, so you're not mentally broken if you experience them as well. So don't feel bad about knowing that you have it. It's the first step in recognizing ways to handle it. Speaking of, one of the fastest ways to help slow those negative thoughts down is to get off of social media for a bit. I don't know about you, but for me, the fastest way for imposter syndrome to attack me mentally is when I'm on social media. And to me, it makes sense, especially in the furry fandom. Furry social media is just a fire hose of everyone's highlights, the parties that they're at, the cool fursuits that they're getting, the crazy art that they're commissioning. It's a fast lane to making me feel like I must be doing something wrong with my life, to not also be where those people are. So for my own sake, I don't spend too much time on furry social media these days. Which I know may sound kind of backward for someone who makes content for those platforms, but it has helped me so much with my imposter syndrome since I'm no longer being bombarded with everyone else's highlights all the time. Now, that can help imposter syndrome from getting worse, but if those thoughts are already brewing in your head, one of the best ways to deal with them is by talking about them. Imposter syndrome, by definition, is irrational, meaning it doesn't make logical sense. You are accomplishing so much, yet you can't recognize it despite all the evidence being there. But one of the best ways to get that evidence in front of you and have your brain recognize it for yourself is to talk about it. Obviously, it really helps to talk about it with people whom you trust. If they care about you, they will go above and beyond to point out all the good things that you are accomplishing. And sometimes that external validation is all you need. But if that's not readily available, something that has helped me personally is changing how I talk and therefore view success for me personally. As someone who makes things for others to share, early on I fell into that trap of basing most of my success on how well my content was being received. So if a video popped off with a lot of views, that was a successful video, and vice versa. The problem with that is it makes comparing my work to other people's work extremely unfair. That idea of comparison being the thief of joy is so true. It's all too easy to prove negatively to yourself that you'll never be as good as someone if you keep using something like views or likes or just general public reception as the sole measure for how good you are at something. So what I've started doing is measuring my success on output, which is something that I can directly control. The fact that I'm making and posting this video is proof that I know how to make content simply by the fact that I've made it. Sure, there are things to learn and take away from each video, but even if a video completely flops, I can't call it a failure because it was produced and shared in the first place. And even if you don't make things, this similar line of thinking can work with something like friends as well. I don't try to focus on how many friends I have, but how much effort I'm putting towards making and maintaining those friendships. So if someone I know doesn't text back immediately, I don't get too upset. The fact that I made the effort to send that text in the first place is valuable. And yes, it sounds simple and maybe even a little self-centered at first, but weirdly, that's kind of the point. Now, it can't fully replace your value system, since if you make output the only thing that you care about, you'll run into one of those phases again and will burn out pretty quickly. Again, I've been there. But adding the fact that you can accomplish things in the first place and have done so in the past to your personal self-worth helps remove everyone else out of the equation of how you value yourself and what you do. At least that's what works for me, and maybe it'll work for you, but again, I'm not a professional in this line of thinking, so if imposter syndrome is really bringing you down mentally, I of course suggest seeing someone who is much better trained at helping you work through these negative thoughts. Though I will say the last piece of advice I will provide can be the theme of this entire video. It's always good to remind yourself of your own value. Because let's not beat around the bush here. You do have value. And trust me, I'm not just saying that. You can ask anyone that knows me really well, and they know how empirical, how pragmatic, how objective, and how logic-based I am and how I live my life, sometimes even to a fault. But even I can say that the fact that you're watching this video means that you have value to someone, especially yourself. So remind yourself that as much as you can, and a common way to do that is by celebrating your successes. Now, I'll admit that this is something that I'm still struggling with, but when combining the idea of celebrating success with adding output to my value system, it makes doing so a heck of a lot easier. I'll give you another example. Instead of just celebrating how many views a video gets, I celebrate how many videos that I've made in a month. And since I have a lot more control over how many videos I make instead of how many views they get, I can feel a lot better about the videos that don't do all that well, since the fact that I made them in the first place is enough to remind myself that I am not totally worthless at this thing. So I hope you've picked up on the fact that I'm making this video just as much for myself as it is for all of you. Imposter syndrome is real and seems to be exceedingly tough to deal with in this fandom. In fact, I'll be honest, for me, it's actually gotten worse the longer I've been in this fandom. With that in mind, I don't want to sell you this lie that you'll eventually get rid of it and that there's some way to stop these feelings entirely. That may not be true, but there are ways to manage it in a healthy way, and when it does come up, remind yourself that you do have value and have a place in this fandom. Seriously, the fact that you're even trying puts you miles ahead of so many other people who have given up and left this community. It's something that everyone faces in this fandom at some point, but kind of like the ferocious beasts that a lot of us like to pretend to be, with the right mindset, imposter syndrome in the furry fandom can definitely be tamed. Alright, thanks for watching, I'll catch you in the next one, but until then, stay wild out there. Peace.